What are you doing on my property? The man's voice cut through the warm Scottsdale morning like a blade through silk. Sharp, contemptuous, laced with the kind of casual cruelty that only comes naturally to people who have never once questioned their own worth. The old man standing on the edge of the manicured lawn didn't flinch. He was wearing a gray jacket that had seen better decades. His shoes were cracked at the toe. His white hair caught the Arizona sunlight and turned it silver, and his hands, large, scarred hands that had once moved mountains, were pressed together in something that looked almost like prayer. He wasn't praying. He was waiting. I said, James Kensington repeated, stepping fully to the front door onto the wide stone porch. What are you doing on my property? The old man lifted his eyes. They were calm, clear, the color of deep ocean water, blue-gray and bottomless, and for just a half-second, something moved through them, something complicated, something that looked almost like grief. I'm sorry to disturb you, the old man said. His voice was quiet but steady, a voice that had once addressed boardrooms, that had once calmed panic markets, that had once told a young boy bedtime stories about courage and patience and the long game. I only wanted a glass of water. It's warm this morning. James Kensington stared at him, the way you stare at something unpleasant that has materialized on your property without invitation. His jaw tightened. He was 47 years old, trim and tanned, wearing a polo shirt that cost more than most people's weekly grocery budget. He had the face of a man who had always believed in his own importance. Strong jaw, sharp eyes, the permanent slight squint of someone who viewed the world primarily as something to be assessed and dominated. Water, James repeated flatly. If it's not too much trouble. A sound from behind James. Heels on marble. Vanessa Kensington appeared in the doorway. She was 43, blonde, polished to a finish that suggested extensive effort and absolute commitment. She wore a white sundress, a gold tennis bracelet, oversized sunglasses that she pushed up into her hair as she took in the scene. Her eyes moved over the old man with the swift, dismissive calculation of someone pricing a piece of furniture at garage sale and deciding immediately it wasn't worth stopping for. Who is this? She asked. Nobody, James said, some vagrant who wandered in off the street. The old man didn't react to the word, not a blink, not a twitch. Vanessa wrinkled her nose slightly. James, the Pattersons are coming for brunch in 40 minutes. I need you to deal with this. I'm dealing with it. She turned and disappeared back inside. James descended one step of the porch. Just one. Enough to assert dominance without getting too close. You need to leave, he said. Right now, I will call the police. I'll go, the old man said. He hadn't moved. A glass of water. I've been walking since early this morning. I don't care how long you've been walking. This is private property. You're trespassing. You have 10 seconds to get off my lawn before I call the sheriff. The old man looked at him for a long moment. There was again that complicated thing moving through his eyes. Grief, yes, but something else. Something patient. Something that had been waiting a very, very long time. Please, the old man said simply. And that word, that single quiet word, was apparently the wrong thing to say. Because James's face changed. The mild irritation shifted into something harder, something performative, as though the pleas had reminded him of an audience. And the audience needed a show. Don't you please me, he said, his voice rising. You think I don't know what this is? You people walk through neighborhoods like this looking for soft targets. Well, I'm not soft. I work for everything I have. I built this life from nothing, and I'm not handing a single cent of it to James. The voice came from behind him and to the left. They both turned. Standing in the doorway, half inside, half out, frozen with one hand on the doorframe, was Grace Kensington, 18 years old, dark hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. She'd inherited her father's sharp cheekbones, but none of his hardness. Her face was open and uncertain. The face of someone who had grown up watching scenes like this one, and had never once found a way to be comfortable with them. She was looking at the old man. The old man was looking at her. Something happened in that exchange that neither James nor Vanessa would have noticed or cared about even if they had been paying attention. Something small and significant passed between an 18-year-old girl and an old man on a lawn in the Arizona morning. Recognition, not a face or name. Something deeper than that. Something the soul does sometimes before the mind catches up. Grace stepped outside. Dad, he just wants some water. Grace, go back inside. He's an old man. Grace. James's voice was a wall. Inside. Now. She didn't move immediately. Her eyes stayed on the old man for one more beat, taking his hands, his clothes, his eyes. Then they dropped to his chest, where the lapel of his old jacket had fallen open slightly. She saw something, a small object, a pin or brooch of some kind, affixed to the inside of the lapel. Old gold, an engraving she couldn't quite make out from here, but the shape, Grace. James's voice, harder now. She went inside. James turned back to the old man. You have 5 seconds. Then I'm calling. The old man nodded once. He turned to go. He had made it 3 steps down the front path. Slow steps, careful steps, the steps of a man whose knees had logged too many miles. When the sound started, water. Vanessa had reappeared. She was standing on the porch with the garden hose, and she had turned it on, and she was directing at the old man's back with the calm, cheerful precision of someone watering petunias. The water hit him between the shoulder blades. He stopped walking. He didn't turn around. He just stopped. There you go, Vanessa said lightly. She was almost smiling. Cool you down. Keep you moving. The water soaked through his jacket, through his shirt. It ran down his neck and into the collar and along his spine, and he stood there in the middle of the front path, drenched, and he did not move and he did not make a sound. James laughed. It was a short, sharp sound, not a real laugh, not the laugh of someone who finds something genuinely funny, but the laugh of someone performing their own cruelty for a private audience, confirming it, endorsing it. Have a great morning, James said. The old man turned around, slowly, with great deliberateness. The water was still running across his shoulders, and the morning sun was catching it and turning it to light, and he stood there soaking wet in his ruined jacket, and he looked at James Kensington, and he smiled. Not a cruel smile, not a bitter smile, not the smile of a man who has just been humiliated and is trying to recover dignity through false bravado. A quiet smile, a knowing smile, the smile of a man who has just received a piece of information he needed and has filed it carefully away in a place where it will be safe and useful. Thank you, the old man said. James's laughter died. Something about the tone had been wrong. Something about the eyes. Something, but the old man had already turned again, and he was walking away, and in 30 seconds he had rounded the corner of the Kensington's immaculate cul-de-sac and disappeared from view. James stood on his front lawn for a moment longer than he should have. Then he shook it off and went inside to get ready for the Pattersons. He had no way of knowing that the old man he had just hosed off his property had designed that property, had selected the lot, had supervised the architectural plans, had written the check quietly through 3 layers of trusts and holding companies for the full purchase price. He had no way of knowing that the same old man currently walking down his street in wet clothes had, 12 years ago, anonymously guaranteed the business loan that saved James's first company from bankruptcy. He had no way of knowing that the pendant in the drawer of Grace's nightstand, the small gold oval she wore every day and had worn since her mother gave it to her at 14, was one of only 2 ever made. The other one was sitting against the old man's chest right now, tucked inside the lapel of his wet jacket. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. His name was Arthur Kensington. He was 73 years old, and he was worth, conservatively, and conservatism here is doing a great deal work, $4.2 billion. Not 4.2 million. Billion, with a B. The kind of wealth that doesn't announce itself, doesn't drive itself to brunch, doesn't wear itself around its wrist or park itself in the driveway. The kind of wealth that has been accumulating silently for 50 years through a combination of extraordinary intelligence, relentless discipline, and a particular genius of someone who understood, when almost nobody else did, that the real money was never in being seen. It was in being the one nobody saw coming. He had built his first company, a 22-hour converted garage in Tempe, Arizona, a real estate development firm that would eventually reshape the commercial landscape of the entire Southwest. By 30, he had branched into energy. By 40, telecommunications. By 50, a diversified portfolio of holdings so vast and so carefully structured that it took a team of 20 accountants and 7 law firms just to keep track of it. He had appeared on exactly one magazine cover in his life, and that was by accident. A background figure in a photo taken at a Phoenix City planning meeting in 1994, and he had considered even that excessive exposure. He did not own a yacht. He did not collect art for display. He lived, when he was not traveling, in a modest ranch house outside Sedona that he had owned since 1989 and had never upgraded beyond functional comfort. This was not performance. This was not eccentricity for its own sake. This was a philosophy, one that arrived at young and never abandoned, that the truest power was a power no one knew you held. He had one weakness: his son. James Kensington did not know he was Arthur Kensington's son. This was not an accident, but the reasons behind it were complicated in ways that the word complicated barely begins to cover. 25 years ago, Arthur had made a mistake, a devastating one, the kind that doesn't announce itself as devastating at the time. It presents as a simple failure of attention, a period of overwork, a marriage stretched thin by ambition and distraction. His wife, Catherine, had taken their 3-year-old son and left. The divorce had been clean. The way divorces are sometimes clean when one party is too exhausted and too guilty to fight. She had returned to her family in Phoenix. She had eventually met someone else. Arthur had tried. Phone calls that weren't returned. Letters that disappeared. Birthday cards that went unacknowledged. He had assumed for years that Catherine had poisoned the well, that she had told James things about him, shaped his silence into something hostile. He had been half right about that. What he hadn't known, what he wouldn't discover until a private investigator's report landed on his desk 11 months ago, was the full extent of it. Catherine had died when James was 9. Before she died, she had given custody not to Arthur, whom she told James was dead, but to her sister Diane. Diane had raised James. Diane had eventually, once James was old enough, shared her version of Arthur, a cold man, a selfish man, a man who had abandoned his family without a second thought and never looked back. James had grown up with a ghost for a father, a villain ghost, the kind that explains every hard thing about yourself and requires nothing of you. Vanessa had come into the picture when James was 31. She was smart and ambitious, and she had recognized in James something she found tremendously useful: a wound. A deep, specific, irreplaceable wound about fathers and abandonment and worthiness that could be kept precisely the right temperature, never quite healed, never quite fatal, to keep him dependent on her judgment and afraid of becoming the man he believed his father had been. She had been tending that wound for 16 years with expert care. And then 11 months ago, a private investigator named Dale Whitfield had walked into Arthur's Sedona living room with a folder, and Arthur had sat down very slowly and read, and understood for the first time in 25 years exactly what happened to his son. He had not called. He had not hired lawyers. He had not sent letters through intermediaries. He had flown to Phoenix, alone without staff or security, and had stood on the sidewalk outside the address in his file, a 5-bedroom house in the Arcadian neighborhood, the house with the lawn, the porch, the stone path, and he had looked at it for a long time. Then he had knocked on the door. Nobody had answered. He had come back the next day, and the day after that, on the 4th visit, he had finally seen them. James pulling into the driveway in a silver Range Rover, Vanessa in the passenger seat, Grace in the back with headphones in and a book open in her lap. And he felt something seize in his chest. The particular violence of recognizing your own blood in a stranger's face. James's jaw, James's hands, James's way of moving. His son, he had raised his hand. A wave, a greeting. Pathetically inadequate as communications go, but it was what he had. James had glanced at him from across the lawn, dismissed him as a neighborhood eccentric, and gone inside. Arthur had stood there for a while longer. Then he had come back the next morning and asked for a glass of water. He was 2 blocks away now, walking slowly, the water from Vanessa's garden hose already beginning to dry in the Arizona heat. He turned down a shaded side street and sat on a low concrete wall and took out his phone. One contact, a Phoenix number. It rang twice. Mr. Kensington. Dale Whitfield's voice. Professional, careful, warm in the way of people who have delivered a lot of difficult news, and have learned exactly what warmth sounds like. "I've made contact," Arthur said. A pause. "How did it go?" Arthur considered the question with the methodical honesty he applied to everything. "He doesn't know me," he said. "He looked at me the way you look at a problem on your lawn. His wife hosed me down with a garden hose." A longer pause. "I'm sorry." "Don't be." Arthur was quiet for a moment. "There's a girl, a granddaughter, Grace. She looked at me differently." "Differently how?" Arthur looked down at his lapel, at the small gold pendant he'd worn inside his jacket every single day for 25 years. The match to the one he'd sent through the mail, anonymously, to a 9-year-old boy on a birthday, hoping it might reach him somehow, hoping some version of him might eventually reach a child of James's. Like she recognized something. Arthur said, "I don't know what, but she looked." "So what's the next move?" Arthur stood up from the concrete wall, straightened his wet jacket, looked up at the blazing Arizona sky with the calm, settled expression of a man who's been playing a very long game for a very long time and knows exactly which move comes next. "The next move," he said, "is to let them believe they've won." Back at the house on Arcadia Lane, brunch with the Pattersons was proceeding without incident. The table was set beautifully. The mimosas were cold. The conversation was exactly the kind of conversation people have at brunches like this. Real estate values, private school rankings, someone's renovation disaster in Paradise Valley, the question of whether the Hendersons were getting divorced, almost certainly based on last Saturday's charity gala behavior. James was fine, mostly fine. There was a small irritant in the back of his mind. Something about the old man's eyes, but he pushed it aside with the practiced ease of a man who had long since stopped examining things that made him uncomfortable. It was Vanessa who kept the story alive. "We had a vagrant on the lawn this morning," she said, refilling Pamela Patterson's glass with the particular delight of someone introducing a good anecdote. "Bold as you please. Just standing there." "No," Pamela said. "I'm telling you." James handled it beautifully. She smiled at her husband. The specific smile she deployed at moments like this. The one that looked like admiration but functioned as instruction. This is the version of events. This is who we are. What did he want? Kyle Patterson asked. "Water." James's voice. Something in it. An odd note, quickly suppressed. "Water," Vanessa repeated with a light laugh. "Can you imagine?" I told James, the audacity of some people. You work your whole life to build something beautiful, and they just walk up and put their hands on it like it belongs to them. "What did he look like?" Grace asked. Everyone looked at her. She was sitting at the far end of the table, her brunch largely untouched, turning her small gold pendant over and over between her fingers, a habit she had when she was thinking hard about something. "Like a vagrant, Grace," Vanessa said. "That's what I just said." "He had kind eyes," Grace said. Silence. "Excuse me?" Vanessa's voice, pleasantly dangerous. "His eyes were kind," Grace said. She wasn't backing down, but she wasn't escalating either. She was just stating a fact the way you state something you observed and are certain of. "I notice." James set down his fork, just for a moment, looked at his daughter with something that might, under different circumstances, have been curiosity. "He was a stranger on our lawn," he said. "That's all." Grace nodded, said nothing else. But later in her room, she would open her nightstand drawer and take out her pendant. She had taken it off after brunch, which was unusual, and she would hold it in the afternoon light and look at the engraving on the back, for the ones who find their way home. She had always assumed her mother had given it to her simply as an heirloom, a pretty thing, a piece of family history, without particular content. But she had seen something flash inside the old man's lapel when his jacket opened. Old gold, a similar shape. And now she was turning her own pendant over and over and thinking about the way he had looked at her. Not like a stranger, not like an old man registering a young face, but like someone finding something, like someone at the end of a very long search. She didn't know yet what it meant, but something in her chest, something precise and quiet and not quite identifiable, was already beginning to understand. 2 miles away, in a rented Chrysler in a parking lot off Camelback Road, Arthur Kensington was on a second call. "The timeline moves up," he said. "How soon?" A woman's voice. Professional. Precise. The voice of Rosalind Avery, senior partner at Avery, Crane and Whitmore, one of the 3 most powerful state law firms in the country. 60 days, Arthur said. Maybe less. A pause. That's aggressive. I've been patient for 25 years, Rosalind. I think I've earned 60 days. A brief silence that was also a kind of agreement. The trust documentation is ready. The property transfers are staged. The holding company restructure is complete. If you move in 60 days, everything will be in place. Good. Arthur looked out the windshield at the brilliant Arizona morning, at the ordinary world going about its ordinary business all around him, none of it aware of what was about to shift beneath it. There's one more thing. What's that? Pull the full transaction history on the Kensington Family Trust disbursements for the last 25 years. Every tuition payment, every business guarantee, every property facilitation, all of it. He paused. I want it documented, dated, notarized. Another pause. Arthur, is that really necessary? My son doesn't know who I am, Arthur said simply. He needs to understand not just what he did, but what he threw away, and what was being given to him every single day while he hated me. His voice didn't waver. So yes, document it, every cent, every transaction, every year. Rosalind was quiet for a moment. I'll have it ready, she said. Arthur ended the call. He sat in the parked car in the Arizona heat and looked at nothing in particular and breathed slowly, the way a man breathes when he is carrying something enormous and has been carrying it for a very long time and knows he must carry it a little longer. Then he started the car and drove. At the house on Arcadia Lane, James Kensington poured himself a scotch at 2 in the afternoon, something he almost never did, and stood at the window of his study and looked at the front lawn. Empty. Perfect. Exactly as it should be. He took a sip. Kind eyes. He didn't know why Grace's words had stayed with him. They were a child's observation, an 18-year-old sentimentality about a vagrant who'd wandered through their morning. And yet, the man had looked at him. For just a moment, before the whole thing with the hose, there had been a look, and James had seen it, and then looked away, because something about it had been unbearable in a way he couldn't name. It was the look of someone who knew him, not knew of him, knew him. The specific intimacy of that gaze, the grief in it, the patience in it, the love and the devastation all wound together. James poured a second scotch. He was being ridiculous. It was a vagrant, a street person who had wandered onto the wrong lawn. But the eyes, he pushed it away, filed it firmly in the drawer in his mind, labeled things I had decided not to examine. A drawer that, over 47 years, had grown quite full. Vanessa appeared in the doorway. The Pattersons love brunch, she said. Good. Kyle mentioned the Harrington commercial parcel is going back to market. James turned from the window, let himself be redirected, let the present close over the strange. Brief hold of morning had opened. Tell me about the Harrington parcel, he said. Vanessa smiled. The real one this time, the one for when she successfully steered him back, and came into the room. Outside, the lawn gleamed in the afternoon sun, and somewhere in the city, an old man in a drying jacket was making the phone calls that would change everything. He didn't just lose his wealth. He lost the one person who had been carrying him all along. And Grace? She was already beginning to figure that out. There's someone at the gate. Vanessa didn't look up from her laptop. Tell them we're not interested. It's not a salesperson, the housekeeper, Dora, said carefully. It's a woman. She says she's from Avery, Crane, and Whitmore. Vanessa looked up. The name meant nothing to her yet. In 48 hours, it would mean everything. Tell her to make an appointment, Vanessa said, and went back to her screen. The woman at the gate left a card. Dora set it on the kitchen counter. It sat there for 2 days untouched, a small white rectangle with neat black letters. The name Rosalind Avery printed below the firm's name with the quiet confidence of someone who has never once needed to oversell their importance. It was Grace who picked it up. She turned it over. Read the back. Mr. A. Kensington requests a private meeting at your earliest convenience. The matter is time-sensitive and concerns the entire family. Grace read it twice. Set it back down. Picked it up again. A. Kensington. She went to her room and sat on the edge of her bed and took out the pendant and held it in both hands and thought for a very long time. Across the city, in a corner office on the 14th floor of a building that technically didn't exist in any public registry, the holding company that owned it was registered to a subsidiary of a trust, Arthur Kensington was meeting with Dale Whitfield. Dale was 52, ex-FBI, with the contained, watchful energy of a man who had spent 30 years learning that most people tell on themselves if you simply wait long enough. He had a folder open on the table between them. Photographs, documents, a timeline laid out in clean columns. Vanessa's background, Dale said, sliding the folder forward. Arthur opened it without urgency. Read methodically. Vanessa Hartley, she had been Hartley before Kensington, had grown up in Tucson. Middle class. Driven in the way that people are driven when they have decided, young, that their circumstances are a personal insult. She had met James at a fundraiser when she was 27. Within 4 months, she had moved in. Within 8, she had isolated him from 3 of his closest friends through a campaign so gradual and so pleasant that none of the 3 men could later identify the precise moment they had been cut out. Within 14 months, she had proposed. She knew about the Kensington name before she met him. Dale said. Arthur looked up. Not about you specifically. Not about the money. She didn't know the scale. But she'd done research on James's family background before the fundraiser. She knew his father was wealthy. She knew there had been an estrangement. Dale paused. She knew there was inheritance potential. Arthur was quiet. She kept it contained. Dale continued. Over the years, whenever James came close to looking into his father's history, and he did 3 times that we can document, something happened. A crisis. A distraction. The first time, there was a major fight about money that consumed them for 2 months. The second time, Vanessa had a miscarriage, and I won't speculate about that. The third time, Arthur's voice steady. She told him she'd looked into it herself. Told him she'd hired someone. Told him the investigator had confirmed his father had died in 2019. Arthur closed his eyes for exactly 3 seconds, then opened them. She told him I was dead. Yes. The room was very quiet. James believe her? James wanted to believe her. Dale said, not unkindly, there's a difference. A man who has been told his father abandoned him at 3 years old, and then grew up being told that father was selfish and cold. When someone tells him the father is dead, part of him is relieved. He doesn't have to make a decision anymore. He doesn't have to feel the complicated thing. Dale paused again. Vanessa is very good at giving James permission not to feel the complicated thing. Arthur looked at the photograph on top of the stack. James at 42 at some corporate event, laughing at something with his head thrown back. The jaw, the hands, the way the laugh lines carved into his face, exactly where Arthur's did. His son, laughing at a party, 5 years after being told his father was dead. What does he actually know about his own finances? Arthur asked. Dale turned to a different section of the folder. This is where it gets significant. James Kensington believed, sincerely and completely, that he was a self-made man. This was the architecture of his entire identity. The thing he repeated at charity dinners and told his daughter on her graduation day, and used to explain the intensity of his contempt for people he perceived as wanting something for nothing. I built this myself. Nobody handed me anything. The truth, laid out across Dale Whitfield's meticulous timeline, was considerably more complicated. His college education, 4 years at Arizona State, then an MBA at the University of Denver, had been paid for through an anonymous scholarship fund. The fund was administered by a trust. The trust was owned by a holding company. The holding company was Arthur's. James had assumed it was a merit scholarship. He had earned it. Arthur had simply made sure the scholarship existed and that James's application reached the right committee. His first company, a commercial real estate development firm called Kensington Property Group, which James had launched at 31 with tremendous confidence and approximately 60 days of runway before the 2008 financial crisis evaporated his initial capital. Had survived because of an emergency line of credit from a private lender. The lender was a Phoenix-based investment entity called Crestline Capital Partners. Crestline Capital Partners was Arthur's. James had paid back every cent of that line of credit over 7 years, with interest, which is the kind of thing that lets a man maintain his sense of having handled his own problems. What he had never known was that without Crestline's call the morning after his primary bank called his loan, a call that arrived at 7:45 a.m., while James was sitting on his bathroom floor trying to calculate how long before he lost everything. The company would have been finished before it started. The house on Arcadia Lane. 5 bedrooms, 3-car garage, the lawn where Vanessa had turned the garden hose on a soaking wet old man 2 weeks ago. Arthur had identified it in 2014 when James had mentioned to a business contact, a contact Arthur had quietly cultivated as an information source, that he was looking for something bigger in the Arcadian neighborhood. The property came on the market 6 weeks later, at a price point 12% below comparable listings. The seller, motivated to move quickly for personal reasons, had accepted James's first offer. The seller had been an LLC. The LLC was Arthur's. There were 9 more entries on the timeline. A malpractice suit against James's company in 2017 that had quietly settled for a fraction of the claimed damages. The opposing counsel had been approached by a third-party mediator whose fees were covered by an anonymous fund. The business expansion into Nevada in 2019 that had succeeded in a market where 3 similar firms had failed. The commercial property they acquired at favorable terms had been sold to them by a trust. The same trust. Over and over. 25 years, Dale said. 63 separate financial interventions. Total value. He turned to the last page. Documented at $41 million. Arthur said nothing. He never knew. Dale said. No. Arthur said. He never knew. Are you to tell him? Arthur looked at the photograph of his son laughing at a party 5 years after being told he was dead. When the time is right, Arthur said, he's going to find out every single thing. Grace found him first. She had kept the card for 4 days, turning the decision over in her mind with a quiet thoroughness that was entirely her own, not inherited from James, who decided quickly and loudly, and not from Vanessa, who decided in advance and performed deliberation. Grace thought carefully and at length and took her time arriving at conclusions that, once she reached them, she held without apology. She called the number on the card from her car, parked 2 streets from home. Rosalind Avery answered on the second ring. Miss Kensington, she said, as though she had been expecting the call. Thank you for reaching out. The card said meeting. Grace said, the man who wants the meeting. Who is he? A brief pause. Professional. Calculated. I think that's a conversation better had in person. Are you available tomorrow morning? Grace looked at herself in the rear-view mirror. Dark hair. Sharp cheekbones. Her father's jaw and something around the eyes that she'd always been told came from her grandmother, a woman she'd never met, a woman her parents had never discussed. Yes, she said, I'm available. The office was on the 14th floor of a building in downtown Scottsdale that looked, from the outside, like an unremarkable professional complex. Inside, it was quiet in the way that genuine power is quiet, no visible ostentation, just quality. The kind of quality that doesn't need to explain itself. Rosalind Avery was 60, silver-haired, and had the measured composure of someone who had spent decades in rooms where fortunes were made, divided, and sometimes destroyed, and had learned that the most useful thing you can be in those rooms is calm. She shook Grace's hand, offered coffee, waited. Tell me who he is, Grace said. Rosalind studied her for a moment. Then, your grandfather. Grace absorbed this. My father's father, she said. Yes. My father believes his father is dead. I know. Is that... Did someone tell him that on purpose? Rosalind's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. That's part of what Mr. Kensington would like to address. Grace sat with the information. She looked at her pendant, which she had put on that morning, without entirely knowing why. He gave this to my father, she said. It wasn't a question. He sent it to your father when your father was 9 years old, Rosalind said. Through the mail. He wanted your father to have something of his, something he could keep. A pause. Your father never acknowledged receiving it. Mr. Arthur Kensington doesn't know whether James actually received it or... My grandmother raised my dad after his mother died. Grace said, Diane Hartley. She looked up. Vanessa's aunt. Rosalind went very still. Vanessa's mother and Diane Hartley were sisters, Grace said. I found this out 2 years ago when I was doing a genealogy project for school. I mentioned it to my mom, Vanessa, and she told me I'd made an error, that I'd gotten confused between 2 different branches. She paused. But I hadn't made an error. I'd checked 3 times. The room was very quiet. Miss Kensington, Rosalind said carefully, I think you should meet your grandfather. He was waiting in the next room. Not the powerful man staging that the setting might have suggested. No imposing desk, no power chair, no theatrical framing. He was sitting in a regular chair by the window with a cup of coffee going cold on the table beside him, and he was wearing a clean version of the same kind of simple clothes, dark slacks, a gray jacket, and he looked like exactly what he was, an old man who'd been waiting a very long time for something and was now in the last seconds before it happened. Grace stepped into the room. He looked at her. She looked at him. There was a moment, long and full and complete, where neither of them said anything. Then Grace reached up and unclasped the pendant from around her neck and held it out in her open palm. And Arthur reached into his jacket and unclipped the one he wore and held it out in his. They were identical, old gold, oval, and on the back of each one, in the same small engraving, for the ones who find their way home. Grace's chin trembled once, then steadied. You stood on our lawn, she said. You asked for water. Yes. They hosed you down. They did. Why didn't you tell them who you were? Arthur looked at her. This extraordinary girl who had figured out in 4 days what her father hadn't figured out in 25 years. And he said the truest thing he knew. Because I needed to know who they were first, he said, before they knew who I was. Grace looked at him for a long time. Then she sat down in the chair across from him and said, Tell me everything. He told her everything. It took 2 hours. He told her about Catherine and the divorce and the years of silence. He told her about the letters. He told her about Dale Whitfield and the 11-month investigation. He told her about the scholarship fund and Crestline Capital and the Arcadia Lane property and all 63 of the entries on the timeline. He told her about standing on the sidewalk outside their house 4 times before she knocked and watching James get out of the Range Rover and feeling his chest seize. He told her about Diane Hartley and the connection to Vanessa that he had only begun to understand. The extraordinary, calculated coincidence that Vanessa had married the son of the man she had already, through her aunt's history, known something about. Grace listened to all of it without interrupting. She was very still, the way she was still when she was processing something enormous, and her hands were flat on the table in front of her, and her pendant was clasped back around her neck. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. What do you want to happen? She asked. I want my son to know the truth, Arthur said. All of it. What was done to him. What was done to me. What was done between us by people who understood that our separation was more useful to them than our connection. He paused. And I wanted to make a choice with that truth. A real one. Not a choice made out of money or fear. His voice was steady and heavy with something. I've been carrying him his whole life from a distance. I just want to know once that he knows it. And if he chooses wrong? Grace asked. If he finds out everything and still chooses her? Arthur was quiet. Then he chooses wrong, he said. And I will have done what I could. Grace nodded slowly. Then she said, What do you need from me? What happened over the next 6 weeks happened in layers, the way the best engineered things do. Each piece invisible on its own, the shape only emerging when you step back far enough to see the whole. Arthur's legal team began the first layer, a meticulous restructuring of public records that would make the scope of his holdings visible for the first time. Not announced, not broadcast, simply made available, registered, documented, searchable, in the way that truth, when properly placed, tend to find people who are looking. Rosalind filed a series of property disclosure documents that linked, for the first time in any public record, the name Arthur Kensington to 17 commercial properties across Arizona, Nevada, California, and Texas, including several that James Kensington's firm had transacted on over the years. The Phoenix Business Journal ran a small item, not a feature, a small item, the kind that gets buried on page 14. Longtime shadow investor Arthur Kensington emerges from private holdings, net worth estimated at $4.2 billion. A real estate contact forwarded it to James with a text message. "Hey, any relation?" James looked at the article for 45 seconds. Then he put down his phone and picked up his scotch and told himself it was a coincidence of names. But he Googled it. And what came back? What populated across his screen and the patient, in different way that the internet delivers the things you've been avoiding, was a photograph. Arthur Kensington, taken in 2019 at a Sedona Preservation Society event, one of the only public photographs that existed. James stared at it, his jaw, his hands, his eyes. "Kinda eyes," Grace had said. James put the phone face down on his desk and sat very still for a long time. Then he called Vanessa. "There's an article," he said. "I saw it," she said. Her voice was its normal register, composed, ahead of it, already spinning. "It's nothing. People share last names. It's a common enough." "Vanessa," his voice quiet, different from its usual register. "Is my father dead?" A pause. The pause was a fraction of a second too long. "James, is my father dead?" She was quiet, and in that silence, in that single terrible hesitation where a woman who'd been lying fluently for 16 years failed, just once, to find the next sentence fast enough, James Kensington felt the ground shift beneath him. 47 years old, a man who had built his identity on a foundation that had just, in the space of a 2-second phone silence, revealed itself as sand. "Come home," Vanessa said finally, her voice calibrating rapidly back to control. "We'll talk about this at home." "Tell me," James said, "right now, on the phone. Is he alive?" Another pause. She was calculating. He could feel her calculating. "It's complicated," she said. James ended the call. He sat at his desk for 11 minutes. He would remember the exact time later, the way you remember strange details from moments that rearrange everything. And then he stood up and got his car keys and drove. He didn't drive home. He drove to the address he'd found in the article. The Sedona Ranch House, 90 minutes north. He didn't call ahead. He didn't know what he was going to say. He just drove. Arthur was on the back porch when the silver Range Rover pulled up the dirt road. He had known, from the moment Rosalind placed the article, that this was one of the possible outcomes, that James would come to him rather than wait to be found. He had prepared for it. He had thought through what he would say, how he would hold himself, what the right and wrong moves were in this specific version of the encounter. All of that preparation became immediately irrelevant when he watched his son get out of the car, because James Kensington, standing in the late afternoon light of the Sedona desert, looked nothing like the composed, contemptuous man who stood on a stone porch and told an old man to get off his lawn. He looked like a person who had just discovered that the map he'd been using to navigate his entire life was drawn for a different country. He walked toward the porch slowly, stopped at the bottom of the steps, looked up at Arthur. They looked at each other. James's jaw was working, not speaking, working. The way a jaw works when the mouth hasn't yet caught up to the enormity of what the brain is trying to say. "You were on my lawn," James said finally. His voice was fractured at the edges in a way he couldn't fully control. "Yes," Arthur said. "You asked for water." "Yes." "And James stopped, the jaw working again. His eyes, his father's eyes, were wet, and the wetness seemed to shock him, seemed to be happening against his will, and he blinked hard against it. "I didn't know," he said. His voice had dropped to almost nothing. "I didn't know who you were." Arthur stood up slowly from his chair, descended the porch steps, stood on the same level as his son for the first time in 44 years. He wanted to say the right thing. He had prepared the right thing. What came out, instead, was the only thing that had been true for 25 years. "I know," Arthur said. "I know you didn't know. That's what I've been trying to reach you to tell you." James's face broke. Not dramatically, Not the way faces break in movies, all at once in a single cathartic release. It broke quietly, in pieces, the way a thing breaks that was never supposed to break and doesn't quite know how. His mouth pressed together, his eyes closed, his shoulders dropped half an inch. He was 47 years old, and he was standing in the Arizona desert, and for the first time in his life, he was looking at his father's face. Arthur put a hand on his son's shoulder. James didn't pull back. And for a few minutes, as the sun dropped lower over the red rocks and turned the desert to fire and gold, they stood like that, father and son, 44 years collapsed into a single moment on the dirt, and said nothing at all. It was, of course, not the end. It was not even close to the end, because Vanessa Kensington had been making calls of her own since the moment her husband had hung up on her, and the calls she was making were not the calls of a woman preparing to tell the truth. Grace, who had spent the last 6 weeks recording, carefully, legally, with Rosalind Avery's guidance on exactly what constituted admissible documentation in the state of Arizona, had 3 conversations saved to a secure cloud folder that she had not yet shared with her grandfather. The first was between Vanessa and Diane Hartley, recorded 6 days after Arthur appeared on the lawn, when Vanessa had realized a vagrant might be something more than a vagrant, and had called her aunt in a register 3 octaves below her usual composure. He can't find out, Vanessa had said. If James finds out about the money, about all of it, everything changes. He stops being manageable. Manageable, Diane had repeated. You know what I mean. Manageable. Grace had said to herself, listening to it the first time, the single word landing like a stone in still water, the rings moving outward through everything she thought she had understood about her family. The second recording was longer, more detailed. The kind of detail that happens when someone who has maintained a lie for a long time begins, under pressure, to shore it up with additional lies, and the additional lies require discussion. And the discussion happens a phone call, and the phone call happens within range of a 20-year-old who has recently become very interested in the truth. The third recording was the one that would end everything. But that was still 12 days away. First, there was a matter of James Kensington standing in the desert at sunset, learning for the first time in his life that the story he had been told about himself was not the story that had actually happened. And Arthur, with infinite patience, beginning to tell him the truth. Not all of it. Not yet. Just enough to open the door. The rest would come. The rest, when it came, would be devastating. There are moments in a person's life that function as dividing lines, moments after which the person you were before it simply cannot survive intact. James would later identify this evening, in the Sedona desert with his father's hand on his shoulder, as the first of those moments. He did not yet know there was a second one coming, a second one that would not arrive on a quiet desert evening with golden light and the possibility of repair, a second one that would arrive in a lawyer's office, in front of witnesses, with footage rolling. And that one, the one that broke not just his assumptions but his certainties, would not be a moment he survived with grief. It would be a moment he survived with the specific, shattering regret of a man who understands, too late, that he was never the person he thought he was. That every achievement he had claimed as proof of his own worth had been quietly, anonymously, lovingly underwritten by the man he had dismissed as a vagrant. The man he had let his wife hose down on his lawn. The man who had been carrying him for 25 years without ever asking to be thanked. That moment was coming. But first, the door had to open. And standing in the desert with his father, for the first time in his life, James Kensington felt it open. Just a crack. Just enough. He thought he had built everything himself. He was wrong. And the proof was already in a folder on a lawyer's desk, dated, notarized, and waiting.